Yes. Hello, students of the Creative Writing course. Here we are meeting again. Now, we are without the cheering and morale-boosting presence of Renu Bharadwaj, our moderator, with whom both you and I have got very friendly, I think. She's been called away on some other work, and I hope the program doesn't suffer because of her absence. Well, we are going to explore and examine the poetry of Kamala Das today, and I hope you are as eager as I am to look behind the curtain of words of her poetry. Now that is rather like Kamala Das herself looking through the windows of her house to see what lies beyond it. It's rather like that, but I hope not quite like that. The poem we are going to dissect and deconstruct is called My Grandmother's House. Let's start with some of its obvious features. Now, on the first reading, this poem reads like any poem of recall. It's like a poem about memories and images that refuse to go away, memories that encroach insistently, images that haunt you and persist into your present and force you to consider them in a more direct and alive way than its intrusions you have learned to bear with patience and pain. This is on the first reading, as I said. And now, before I go on, I'd just like to say that I do hope the points that get raised in this little discussion we are going to have will help you in tackling the question that is attached to your course on Kamala Das. The question is, do you think this is a poem about the present or the past? Give reasons for your answer. Now, I hope what we are going to talk about today, how we tackle the points that get thrown up, will help you answer this question. Now, let us see how and at which points of the poem this sense of distance, of the farawayness of a time gone and over and done with forever, is evoked. Let us see the words and phrases that evoke this sense of stubborn memory. I think it happens in the very opening lines. The opening line is, "There is a house now far away where once I received love." Now let's recite these lines again. The magic of poetry, the spell and enchantment it casts, is so much due to the sound of the words, don't you think? Poetry is never silent, even when you read it silently to yourself. Words are never silent, even in print. So here we go. We'll read the line just once more. There is a house now far away where once I received love. The past becomes many kinds of past in those lines. There is a house, the lines begin. It is in the present tense. Is a house, not was a house. But when you see it with the next phrase, now far away, is becomes was, the present becomes the past. Now far away evokes the time present in the poet's mind. It is distinct from the time outside, the time which we measure in units of seconds, of minutes, of months, of years. The house, then, is not far in the geographical sense of what is far, what is near. It is far away, far back in time. And this time is the time flowing in the poet's mind. We all have our own time running at its own speed, in addition to clock time or planetary time. So now, is the house in the present or the past? Well, it is in the present of the past. It is in the past of the present. It is like seeing both sides of a coin together, simultaneously. The full sentence is, where once I received love. That is, there is a house now far away where once I received love. That is a full sentence. Now it has been broken into two lines in the poem. That concluding phrase situates the whole poem firmly now in the past. It stills its way between past and present. That woman died. The poem runs on, and now for the next 4 lines, The hold of the past is steady, and you hear the even tone of a collected recall. Let's read the lines and hear this tone. That woman died, the house withdrew into silence, snakes moved, among books I was then too young to read, and my blood turned cold like the moon. It is a picture of a slow and total standstill that is established by these lines. Now, that is something that I'll have to explain. I can see that. Let me make a start by seeing where the sense and image of standstill takes root, with which word and phrase. Next, I think I'll take stock of the substreams and tributaries of emotions that take off from the main tone of collected recall and give body to it, thereby firmly etching the picture of standstill. Ready then? Here we go. The sense of a standstill is set off by the word withdraw. The house withdraws into silence. Now that is a very eloquent, packed sentence. A house does not speak, but it speaks in the wordless, gestural way that a tree speaks, or a river speaks, or a flower, an animal, a bird, sunshine, rain. In the way every object speaks, the house speaks in this way. It is filled with speech. When this secret and ever-present buzz of it ceases, it is a momentous happening. This cessation is not a standstill yet, though. The word withdraw is not a word that carries a sound of finality with it. There is a sense of tentativeness about it, a margin of possibility of the withdrawal being revoked, reversed. But it presages what is to come. It is like a curtain raiser, say. This feeling of an impending freeze-up, an arrest, is intensified. It gets more built up by the two succeeding linked phrases. Snakes moved among books I was then too young to read. Snakes moving among books is a terrifying phrase. You see a picture of a slow, ceaseless, ominous, coiling and gliding through still stacked books. And again, the sensations produced by the image are contradictory, divergent, yet they are linked. The glide of the snake spells silence, but the words forming the image are filled with sound, with a kind of drugged, trance-like speech of premonition. They were, the author says, books I was too young to read, and with that phrase of extreme youth and the incapacity, the powerlessness of extreme youth, the sense of slow decay invoked by the image of snakes slithering among books unites. The two unite, they ramify, and with this welding of sense and sensation, of phrase and image, the idea of a past that is really the past now is firmly established, a past finished and done with. It is alive only in the poet's mind. It is the death of a past that brings about the standstill evoked by the first 5 opening lines of the poem that we have considered so far. Now here we come to the second stage of our line of reasoning. This standstill is a kind of take-off point for the poem. After it comes a charged outpouring of sheer hopeless unhappiness. This lament is the core of the poem, but the state of standstill is still very much there in these charged sections of the poem too. It gets more emphasized, more pronounced, because the poet is consciously, deliberately reaching out to the dead past. She's fully aware of the futility of doing so. The poem ends on this note of conscious futility, of bitter awareness of a stalemate. Maybe I should read out the poem to illustrate this. I'm going to do so gladly. It's always such a pleasure reading poems aloud. So here we go. How often I think of going there to peer through the blind eyes of windows, or just listen to the frozen air, or in wild despair pick an armful of darkness to bring here to lie behind my bedroom's door like a brooding dog. You cannot believe, darling, can you, that I lived in such a house and was proud and loved, I, who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least in small change. I think those are really very powerful lines. The idea of futility is dramatized. It is taken to a climax, and ultimately it is made a synonym for the poet. The most vivid lines here are those where she speculates about picking an armful of the darkness that lies thick in and around the house and letting it lie at her door like a brooding dog. Now, on first reading, the imagery seems faulty. An armful of darkness and like a brooding dog. These two phrases do not form a cogent image. Darkness is formless, it is fluid. To liken it to something as solid and as defined as a dog seems clumsy. But 2 lines later are the lines where she says she's like one who has lost her way and begs at strangers' doors. The image of dog blends with begging. Now, I'm not demeaning dogs here at all. I must clarify, I'm a dog lover. But this fact of dog and begging, the 2 words somehow unite. And the awkwardness that we earlier felt, this awkwardness is dispelled. And now we come to the next stage of a line of reasoning. From this clearing that is made by the exit of the awkwardness, by the dispelling of the awkwardness that I spoke of earlier, the note of futility gets pronounced, gains sharp overtones of violence. It is the violence that is produced when the sufferer of the violence flings his suffering at his tormentor, makes him flinch, sees him flinch, relishes the sight, and reaps the momentary triumph of the weak. That flash of mocking anger, fully enjoyed and relished, is the final note of the poem. This final note doesn't come at the end, though. It is not final in the sense of placing, of where it is placed in the poem, at which point. It comes just before the end, but it rises above the last lines. For these last lines are just a restatement of feelings expressed before in the body of the poem. Let us now see how this flash of anger rises clear of the last lines and stays spread as the final note of the poem. I have once again a pleasant interlude of reading. You cannot believe, darling, can you, that I lived in such a house and was proud and loved. Those are the concluding lines. The poetic voice rises to its highest pitch here in those lines. All the pent-up feelings of neglect and of being downvalued, of being given scant respect, rush into the voice here and keep it taut, keep it at an interrogative pitch. The quivers of this pitch linger, unfading, and they easily overspread the aggrieved, accusing tone of the concluding lines. And what are those concluding lines? The concluding lines are, I, who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least in small change. You cannot believe, darling, can you, that I lived in such a house and was proud and loved? I, who have lost my way and beg now at strangers' doors to receive love, at least a small change. Now, at the level of words, those concluding lines do catch the attention. Those concluding lines of, I who have lost my way and am now begging at beggars' doors to receive a little bit of love. That is, at the level of words, they catch the attention, but at the level of thought, they do not make the leap to bitter irony in the way that the lines just before them do. A thought that is laced with irony does have more staying power. This can be stated as a general principle. If a thought is laced with irony, if it has irony, if it is shot through with irony, that thought is going to stay longer in your mind. Now, these concluding lines that we've just been discussing don't have any trace of irony in them, so they evaporate. But the lines before them overspread these lines and stay as the concluding thought of the poem. I think we have now examined all the segments and arcs of time through which this poem traverses. Now, how are we now to answer the question of past and present that the poem raises? The answer, I think, is that it spreads, the poem spreads over both past and present. It spans both dimensions. It's like a house that has doors opening out to both east and west. There are such houses, you know. We spent a lot of time studying this poem. We've tried to locate its pulse points, its nerve centers. I think it would be a little difficult now to examine and ingest another poem so soon. At least I wouldn't be able to muster up the energy, and perhaps now would you be. We have some time remaining, so let us now try to formulate and arrange the rules we have adopted here to get to the core of the poem. Perhaps these rules can be applied to gauge poems generally. First, I think, is the sound of the poem. To get to this sound, now this is important, I think, to get to the sound of the poem, you have to read it aloud to yourself. The sound of the words as they strike your chords of hearing and as they emerge audible makes the words somehow dynamic. It's something like the effect made by the sight and smell of a flower. It's a more complete effect. It's a more total effect. The sound of the words stir the power of association. It makes the words alive, makes them live, makes them motile. Motile means, I'm sure you know it, but just in case you don't, motile means the innate power of motion present in living organisms. Well, the heard words open up and they disclose subtleties of meaning vaguely felt in the silent reading. When you read it aloud, when you read the words aloud, they transfuse entire lines and sections with fresh force. We've seen this happen again and again in this poem we've just considered. The word withdraw, for instance. When you read aloud the phrase, the house withdrew into silence, when you read it aloud, you wake to the full implications of the word withdraw. You see, you sense a certain slowness, a gradualness to the whole motion of withdrawing. You connect it more closely than you do with the silent reading. You connect it with the succeeding phrases and images of snakes moving among books, of the extreme youth of the poet, which put the books beyond reading for her. All the slow, creeping states of prolonged neglect, of decay, of the distance caused by youth and adolescence come vividly to the eye, set off by the word withdraw. And equipped thus with the many modes of the sense of slowness contained in the word withdraw made audible when you say it aloud, you unite fully with the main idea of those lines, the idea of standstill, of stalemate. So the rule, I would say, is read the poem aloud to yourself as many times as you can. Listen to the acoustics of the words and feel yourself being borne along on their sound waves to the heart of the poem. There is one last suggestion I'd like to make about reading Kamala Das's poems. You read her autobiography. This autobiography is probably out of print now. It was published in 1976 and it was counted among the 10 best books published in that year. But it may still be there in the libraries. In any case, photostats of the book can be made of the few existing copies. One of them happens to be my own. And now here, this should interest you, the price of paperbacks at that time was never more than 8 rupees. That is, this was in 1976. Kamala Das's was a sterling paperback. It must have been similarly priced. I don't think it was more than 8 rupees. Now, that bit of digression apart, the point is that a lot of the heavy mood of the poems can be traced back to her own accounts of her own life. The sense of intense alienation from people and relationships in her poems is made explicit in her autobiography. This autobiography is called My Story, by the way. Of course, it is not necessary to know about the poet to read and understand her poetry. But the tone of this particular autobiography is so like the tone of her poetry that they seem companions. They seem to complement each other. In fact, the autobiography can be read as a core text to the poems. The references to nature that she makes in this poem, there are 5 nature allusions in a poem of some 16 lines, in this poem that we just finished considering. Now, these references can be seen here, as in the autobiography that is, as more than poetic utterances. They can be seen as the intense identification with nature that she really has in her life. Similarly, the line about begging for love at strangers' doors can be seen as actual happenings in the pages of the autobiography. She really did solicit strangers for the love she craved for and dreamed about. And thirdly, the poem we have considered here appears as a prologue to a chapter in the autobiography called The Passing Away of My Great-Grandmother. This chapter is about the life and very unhappy last days of the poet's great-grandmother. In your course, the poem is called My Grandmother's House. This discrepancy is worth noting. It is interesting, for it makes no difference to the nature and contents of the poem. The density of the past is not affected one bit. There is a generation gap in the poem, in the title of in the 2 titles. But the poem is unaffected by this gap, by this factual deviation. The point here, I think, is that the prose medium of the autobiography gives an expansion to the poetic utterances. I think this can help a lot in our overall comprehension of the poetry. The autobiography can be a valuable aid in understanding her poetry. I think we've almost come to the close of the talk now. In our next meeting, we might perhaps take up the other poems of Kamala Das included in your course. I hope you found this session useful and worthwhile. And may I now, before closing, suggest 2 questions you might tackle. The questions are, would you agree that reading a poem aloud to oneself is a good way of comprehending it? I'll repeat the question. Would you agree that reading a poem aloud to yourself is a good way of comprehending it? Question number 2, I should think, do you tend to lose patience with the very aggrieved tone of Kamala Das's poems. This can irk. Does it irk you? It tends to irk me, if I may say so. But I can get over it. Because as you read on, you see that you are not supposed to get irked. You don't want to get irked. And then you find reasons for not getting irked also. I would like to know if this is the way you also feel about the capacity to irk that the poem does have, that the poetry does have. Goodbye and good luck. It's just half an hour.